Hi, everyone. I'm Katherine Sanders from Sanders Consulting, and this is one of the conversations in my series of conversations about the Surgeon General's framework for workplace well-being and mental health. And I'm here today. It's my pleasure to be talking with Meico Marquette Whitlock from the Mindful Techie. And Meico, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today about workplace well-being. And I'd like us to start by you telling all of us a little bit about yourself and your expertise and interest in workplace well-being.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Catherine, for having me here. So I am a workplace wellness consultant, and I work specifically with change-making organizations. So these are organizations that have an explicit mission, whether they're in nonprofit, government, or for-profit sector, but they have an explicit mission on improving some aspect of well-being for people, animals, or the environment. And so
Mm.
the work that I do with those organizations is using training, coaching, and consulting to really support those organizations in doing what I describe as increasing their well-being so they can increase their well-doing and changing the world and doing the meaningful work that they're doing out there.
That's fantastic. And I know you yourself have a very interesting background and have worked in some nonprofits as well as the government. So if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your own trajectory of career, that would be great.
Absolutely. The center of why I do what I do is really centered on my upbringing. So raised primarily by a single mom and understanding the sacrifices that she had to make for myself and my brother to really make the life and the opportunities that we have possible. And I made a decision very early on that because of that, I wanted to dedicate my professional career to some form of public service. And that started really after college, my first real job working in a nonprofit role, doing communications work and tech work for other nonprofit organizations. I ultimately ended up working in government. I've done software development in the for-profit sector. But across all of that, particularly in the nonprofit and the government roles, one of the things that I noticed was that there was this normalized cycle of burnout and
Mm.
overwhelm. People really sacrificing themselves, putting in what some folks describe as the hero hours in service of the mission, and really doing that at the expense sometimes of their own personal well-being and relationships. And I came up against that with my own challenges. I started actually in one of my roles at an association that um, didn't have a full-time communications person. So I was the first full-time communications hire. And one of my mandates was really to build out the team, put in place the processes and strategies. And I enjoyed that work. It was very impactful work, really focused on the intersection of HIV and hepatitis, which is a very important issue domestically and internationally. So I was really passionate about the work and doing my role. But I also reached a point where I was burned out or on the edge of burnout and really faced a life-threatening condition where I
Mm.
recognized that I had a choice to really think differently about how I was approaching the work. And so that was really a life up moment for me, seeing number one, the cycle over the years of my colleagues burning out and normalizing that, and then having my own experience that really caused me to reflect and really ask, okay, well, if I were to drop dead now, from overwork, like what will my legacy be, right?
Mm.
And will my legacy be simply that I managed projects well, that I was good at answering emails? Like there has to be something more than that. And so I had that realization and realized that I wanted something more, and that there had to be a more sustainable way to do this work. Because if there wasn't, then who would ever be around long enough to do the good work that many of these change making organizations are doing? And so that was really the start of Mindful Techie, which is my organization right now, which is focused specifically on helping change makers in this well-being space. And then with the name of my organization, really quickly, I started out really focused specifically on the tech aspect of that. You know, we when I started, technology really became a more embedded part of our life and our work, and I felt that there was a gap there in terms of how we approach wellness. That the technology piece was sort of left out of that. So I support change makers in taking intentional approaches to tech in both the professional and the personal context. But it also expands beyond that to mindful leadership, mindful productivity, and some of the other aspects of well-being in the workplace.
It hurts my heart to hear someone as young as yourself, be thinking about the end of your life because of, being overwhelmed and overworked. I mean, it just really says a lot about, as you said, the normalization of burnout and exhaustion in the workforce nowadays, and how, I mean, as a work systems engineer myself, I've had so many innumerable people tell me, well, work is work for a reason, and so it's like we've got this definition that work has to be something that is exhausting. Work has to be something that is unsustainable long term, right? And choose through people. And at the same time, your story is of particular interest to me because the meaning level is high.
Hmm.
It's not like just going into a factory and feeling like you're a cog in a machine and that your work isn't meaningless and exhausting. But, for people like yourself who, this is my language, not yours, so feel maybe
Sure.
they have a calling towards something. I work with a lot of people in healthcare who feel that they are healers and they are meant to be in that role. If you have a calling towards something, you're a teacher, you're in public health, like you had served, you might feel tremendous meaning, but that doesn't make the exhaustion any less important, right? And in
Yes.
fact, it can actually feed it.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that story. I think a lot of people relate to that.
Absolutely.
Um, I want to share the Surgeon General's model here. I know you've seen it and you actually teach about it and help organizations, um, I don't know, become aware of it at least,
Yes.
I mean, like, I don't know, it isn't possible to quote implement it because it's, a system, right? You
Yeah.
start one place and you end up many places. But I would love to hear, as you look at this, what stands out for you? What are you drawn to?
So for me, one of the buckets that really stands out to me is something that you really hit on previously in terms of high meaning and really connection to mission. So for me, the mattering at work
Mm.
pillar is something that I think is critically important. Often when we talk about workplace well-being, at least the way that I've seen it expressed, um, oftentimes it's really transactional or is really focused on what I would call the outer work, right? So the outer work, as I describe it, is how well are we managing time? How well are we managing people? How well are we managing energy? How well are we managing our projects, right? But there's the inner work. The inner work is about our meaning and connection to the work, our why. It's about what's happening internally in terms of mentally and emotionally, how are we actually thinking about and showing up for our work. It's about how we're being present for ourselves and for others. And so from my perspective, the way I think about this, when we marry the inner work and the outer work, then we can go about doing what I would describe as mindful change making work, right? We can go about doing the good work of actually fulfilling the mission of our organizations and also doing that in a sustainable way that actually feeds us and nourishes us and balances those things at the same time. And so, as I understand how the Surgeon General framework really articulates this, there are a couple of points that I think are really important in terms of practical things that make up this part about mattering at work. This includes things like meaningfully including teams and your coworkers or the folks that you are managing in workplace decisions, right? Asking for and actually acting on the feedback. Um, Having a culture of gratitude and recognition. I'm surprised when I work with teams and organizations. Um, how often people underestimate the power of simply acknowledging, hey, like we recognize that you worked overtime this week and we really appreciate you for doing that, right? Something as simple as saying thank you for that. Or I know that you didn't have to do this, or I know that this particular thing was really challenging. Really appreciate how you stepped up to the plate for X, Y, and Z. Like those things really matter and can have a significant impact. And those are things that don't really cost a lot in terms of monetary compensation. The final point that I'll make here that really intersects with how I think about this for this particular part of the Surgeon General's framework is really figuring out how you're connected to organizational mission and I know that I'm talking about this in the context of change making work where it might be more explicit or more clear. But I also want to share, if I can, a brief example of my mom who worked in retail most of her professional career. And when I talked to her, um, that is not something, looking back on it, that perhaps she would have chose for herself, right? That was this was a situation that she found herself in, and she made a decision very early on that she was going to make the best of that situation. And so you can be in an organization that might not necessarily be your ideal fit, and you can still find meaning and connection to how you're going to serve. For my mom, that meant that she made a decision that she was going to show up and give her best 110% no matter what. That turned into, stellar reviews in terms of customer service. That turned into her being a de facto team leader, even though she wasn't actually in a leadership role. People actually looked up to her, right? That turned into the fact that now that she's retired, former coworkers, some still work there, some have moved on to other roles, are texting her on holidays and birthdays and sending her things because they remember her presence and what she brought
Mm.
to that role. And so when we think about mission, oftentimes we're focused on, well, do I actually 100% line up with what my factory or what you know, my store or what my nonprofit organization is doing? Well, for most people, there isn't necessarily that 100% alignment. For most people over the course of their lifetime are not going to find that. And so you have to figure out, how do you find your piece of satisfaction? How do you find your piece of connection to mission, whether that's personal or whether that's professional, and using that as leverage to help you support, setting boundaries to take care of yourself and also to do your best to support whatever role you're supporting in the professional context.
Well, I love the things that you've highlighted, and I love how, this is a framework that's about a system, right? And so when you were talking about employee input being valued and sought after and used, right? That to me speaks to this worker voice and equity that the Surgeon General's framework has in its center. And then the story about your mom's impact speaks to me so much of connection and community that she somehow was part of, making other people feel like they belonged and they were supported, and, being an informal leader, even if you don't have the positional authority, you have the
Yes.
informal influence and authority. I mean, it's a beautiful story about how all of these pieces fit together, I think, at least for
Yes.
me. And also your comments earlier about how your mom's career took care of, her family. So this
Yeah.
work-life harmony, somehow she, I don't know what it felt like when you were growing up, when she was working all these hours, right? Or how she made that fit. But I think it's something that everyone is trying to do who has a family or people or even pets at home that they're trying to care for. So
Absolutely.
yeah, really lovely. Thank you for sharing that. Um, if, and I know you do this for a living, so I expect that you'll have a number of things to share here, but if an
Sure.
organization is wanting to move in the direction of increased well-being for its people, do you have guidance or something, that advice or process you'd like to share with us about what you would recommend a starting place might be?
Yes. So I'll share a few practical things, the small things that you can start wherever you are, and then I want to share a framework that provides like a more robust approach to this. So I'll start with the simple. So the first place, I think, is to simply acknowledge the reality that there's this tension between our well-being and, balancing that with however your workplace is set up, right? Let's just simply acknowledge that reality. I think sometimes we're tempted to put our head in the sand and pretend like, oh well, you know this is just the way it is, like we're resigned to a certain state, right? Or we're sort of pretending that things are better than they actually are, and we're engaging in a form of toxic positivity, and that can
Oh,
be.
ooh, say more about that toxic positivity, please.
Yeah, so the way that I think about this, and there are other folks who have defined this, but the way that I think about this is sort of where we pretend that things are okay, or we're expecting people to, for example, um, put on a smiling face and be okay when they're actually not okay, right? And so we're expecting people to, for example, be happy about the change in policy around working from home, for example, when they're actually not, for example. Or we ask questions like, Catherine, you're not smiling today. Can you turn on your camera and smile for us, please? This is going to help us build the team and build camaraderie, right? Whereas, what if we actually made space for people to really acknowledge how they're actually feeling in the moment? And I love one of the exercises from Brene Brown. She talks about how she does team check-ins, and one of the exercises that they do in terms of icebreakers to simply ask people to describe 2 words or share 2 words in the chat that really describe how you're feeling right now in this moment. And that can mean, oh, well, I'm optimistic about this new project that I'm working on, and I'm really sad that my dad's in the hospital, right? And you can have that contradiction. And one of the things that I've been fascinated by is that the research actually shows with this type of acknowledgement, especially in the team setting, where um, things might not be going well, right? Is that acknowledging that and being vulnerable, especially if you're modeling it as a team leader, it increases psychological safety, it increases trust, it increases a connection to a shared mission, and it increases a motivation to want to collectively work together through that, right? And
Mhm.
so as a team leader, I can acknowledge, you know what, Catherine, you're right. This work from home policy, this new policy, like it really does suck. And I'm sorry that, we're having to make this rough adjustment. I want to acknowledge that it's not working out well for everyone, and we're doing the best that we can to to accommodate everyone or to learn as an organization and to improve moving forward. But we appreciate you really sharing that. I'm going to take your feedback to the leadership team and so on and so forth. And so one of the beautiful things about that acknowledgement piece is that you don't have to have an answer,
Mhm.
right? Simply acknowledging and giving people space to acknowledge that things aren't working sometimes is more than enough. Many times, particularly as team leaders, we think we have to know all of the answers. We have to have a solution, but sometimes people just want to get something off their chest. Sometimes people want to vent. Sometimes people just want to feel seen and heard. And that goes back to the mattering piece that we talked about previously.
Yeah, I know you have more to share on this point, but I just want to say I've had so many people tell me that, I'm from engineering, right? And so there's this hesitation. I don't want to be too touchy-feely, and I don't want to, you know, get off into the weeds talking about people's emotions as if they're not having them if we don't talk about them, right? I
Exactly.
mean, it's so bizarre, right? Because the
Yes.
reality is this is happening. And as you're pointing out, I think it's the most practical thing in the world to A, acknowledge it's happening, and then B, try to be supportive in whatever ways that is, even if it's, I'm so sorry to hear that your father's ill. You know what I
Yes.
mean? And it also gives you a heads up about someone's capacity, as
Yes.
which is the most practical thing in the world. So as you said very eloquently, it's not about fixing all of this. It might be about trying to support if we can, right? If it's about the ergonomics of your home, setup, maybe we can fix that. But I can't
Yes.
fix you having suffering of a loved one. But I can be mindful that you might need more flexibility or even, family leave eventually, right? So I think
Excellent.
it's not touchy-feely. It's the most rational thing in the world to ask people how they're doing and then to try to
Mhm.
support them, right? I think it's fabulous. So thank you for the explanation of toxic positivity. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Hmm.
So for the next point, I want to actually share my screen and share a visual aid that might be helpful here. So the second point is sometimes, particularly at the organizational and team level, we are quick to jump at trying to solve things at a systems level. Now, I know this might make you cringe as a systems engineer, but I want you hear me out. So systems, at least the way that I think about this, and you can correct me in terms of the technical way to think about this, but the way that I think about this, systems are made up of parts, right? And when we think about workplace well-being in the workplace, we are part of a system. And I think we're probably the most basic unit, right, in a system. And so I invite people when we think about workplace well-being, before you jump into trying to change other people and systems and organizations, really think about what your closest sphere of impact is, which is you, and to pause and refill your cup. So for folks that fly a lot, um, you've probably heard the safety instruction a lot. You know, in the event of an emergency, you know, your oxygen mask might actually drop down from the ceiling. And if you're in need of oxygen, please put on your oxygen mask first, secure your oxygen mask first before then you're able to help other people secure their oxygen mask. The same thing applies here. If you're trying to address an issue in your organization, in this case, we're talking about workplace well-being or whatever the changes that you're trying to institute, uh, the most effective long-term sustained change you're going to be able to make is going to actually start with you embodying whatever it is, you practicing, you working with, you evolving out loud and being vulnerable and actually showing the way with whatever the changes that you're looking for. So at the individual level, some small things this includes is, you know, if you're having mental health issues, for example, reaching out to HR, reaching out to your emergency or your employee assistance program to see what mental health services might be covered in your insurance, right? Looking for and being a part of a like-minded community of peers, or something as simple as if you're experiencing burnout. This is something that's underrated. I always tell people as a first starting point, sometimes burnout isn't necessarily connected always to work. Sometimes there's something else happening. So I always recommend folks go to your primary care physician, particularly if it's been a while, and get a checkup and see what else might be going on with you. I've talked to so many folks that say, yes, I'm dealing with burnout in the professional context, but it actually turns out I have this other condition that I'm dealing with. And I have depression or I have some other chronic condition that is really impacting how I'm able to show up and really being addressing those co-occurring things actually over the long term has a long term more sustained impact in terms of helping people to be at their best, and to not contribute to what I was talking about earlier, which is the toxic productivity where someone might legitimately be trying their best but they're still not able to show up in a certain way. And so I think this
Mhm.
is critically important. Um, the final point that I will make here is assessing your organization's level of mental health and well-being before you jump into trying to fix things. And I like to there is a more extensive assessment and set of questions I can give people, but as a starting point, I always ask people to start with two questions. What's the biggest challenge that I'm having, my team is having, or my organization is having right now with fill in the blank, whatever the context is. So in this case, workplace well-being, for example. The second question is, what do I actually need right now to make the situation better, to make work better for me? Those are two simple questions that you could ask in the form of an anonymous survey. You can ask in the form of check-in. You can ask in the context of 90-day review. There are a whole host of ways that you can get at those, but the basic framing, you don't have to use the same language, but the basic essence and intention behind those, I think is a great place to start for folks who are looking for a place to start.
Miko, would you call that, and in my mind, that sounds like some sort of like an audit of, in this case, well-being, workplace well-being? Is that,
Yes,
do you have language that's different than that, or how do you describe the process you're starting to articulate?
I would describe it as assessing where you are.
Assessing.
And
Okay.
the way I describe this is there are folks that have like formal frameworks around research evidence-based burnout framework, for example, and there are questions from those types of frameworks that might be helpful for folks.
Mhm.
Um, what I'm giving to folks is a place to start and recognizing number one that it doesn't have to be that, right? Like you're not doing a research study, you're not doing a double blind trial, right? You're trying to get at resolving an immediate issue that you're having in your organization, and you're trying to figure out where do you start. You can refine things later,
Mhm.
but particularly if time is of essence, if you're just trying to check the pulse, if you have very few resources, for example, this is a very simple place to start. And I think for most people in organizations, no matter where you are in an organization, you can start by asking this question of yourself, and then you can move up to your team, et cetera, based on your level of influence and impact in your organization.
What I really love about that is the focus on what can we do to improve. I think I totally resonate with what you're saying about the research mindset in organizations. It's become prevalent, right? And I was trained to be a researcher in this area, so I can relate to it. Like a university wants to come in, they want to collect data, they want graduate students to have data, to make models, to be able to write dissertations, to be able to graduate. I mean,
Yes,
and then they make models and they publish the research, and it's fabulous. This is good. But
yes,
if you're in an organization and you get the annual survey and you fill it out with all of the, dozens of questions, and then you see all the graphs and they have all the listening sessions, and then nothing ever changes,
yes,
the researchers might be happily making all their models and everything,
yeah,
but your life doesn't get better, right?
exactly.
So this whole thing about being action oriented in the local groups, I think, is really important. And yeah, so I'll just stop there. So do you have more you want to share about guidance for people to get started?
Yes, I'll share one more thing, which is, so I gave you the three practical things, and I'm glad you talked about as well the difference between sort of putting things into action and research, right? That they both have their value. The value that I bring to organizations is really in moving beyond that to actually making this, when we talk about well-being while well-doing, actually making that practical, making it actionable, and making it accessible. I think that is so important. Yes, evidence base is important. You want to make sure that you're investing your dollars in a way that's going to get an ROI on investment. But I think oftentimes we overcomplicate things unnecessarily in this particular area. And sometimes we use it as an excuse not to actually take action, I believe. Um,
Yeah, you can start a bunch of complicated things that never ever change what's happening on a day-to-day basis, right? So I love
yes,
it.
yes. So, one of the ways I think about this is the sort of the framework that I'm going to describe, or really, so it's a framework, but it's really a collection of invitations. The way I frame this and think about this, for being a mindful, what I would describe as being a mindful change maker. And so we use the change acronym here, and these are, from my perspective, six core areas that you want to be simultaneously operating in order to embody well-being while well-doing. If you think of this like driving a car, on your dashboard, you have the odometer. It tells you how fast you're going. You have the oil indicator, lets you know how you're doing on oil. You have the temperature gauge, letting you know like how hot the engine is. All of those things are important simultaneously for you to be able to make sure that you are maintaining your car and that you are safe while you're on the road. Similarly, these are invitations that are on your dashboard of well-being while well-doing. Very briefly, connecting with your why. We already talked about that in terms of mattering at work. For me, this is really the foundational piece, and this is one of the first places that I start when I work with organizations. Is really, let's talk about why you're doing this work, right? Are you trying to make money for retirement? Do you have a more noble cause? Like, and it's not a judgment. It's really
Mhm.
about you being honest about where you are. Are you here because you have to make money to pay off X, Y, and Z, for example? Are you here because you really want to save the whales, right? Are you here because you just really like hanging out here and you think it's a cool place to work for, right? Whatever it is, no judgment, but you want to be clear about what that actually is. And then being clear about what are your priorities that are connected to that why, whether it's personally or professionally. And so what can you do to actually honor those priorities? And so this particular area gets into more practical. Okay, I understand why I'm here, but how can I align my priorities personally and professionally to actually drive the reason why I'm actually here? The third invitation here is about acknowledging your limiting beliefs. And this is really about getting into some of that inner work that I was talking about earlier, right? So we have imposter syndrome, for example. We have thoughts about it's inappropriate to actually be vulnerable and share what's happening with your family or with you personally at work, for example. Maybe you think someone's being passive aggressive and that's getting in the way of you getting things done, for example. Maybe you have access to mental health services, but you are afraid to ask for that because you feel like you're going to be judged for that, right? And you're going to be dinged for that. Those are very real. And so I work with folks on acknowledging those things and constructively confronting those things and recognizing that those fears, those doubts, those limiting beliefs that we have are a natural part of our human experience and how we show up. But they don't have to be barriers to personal and professional growth, right? We can learn to manage them. We can learn to navigate them in the same way that I describe it as sort of like a puppy. A puppy, an untrained puppy might bark at everything that you see because it thinks it's protecting you when you go out on your walks or you go out publicly, right? But over time, most puppies can be trained to behave differently over time, right? And so it's the same thing with taming your fears and your doubts so that they can work for you as opposed to against you. Um, Negotiating boundaries is the fourth invitation here, which is really about how do we effectively say yes and no so that we make space to honor the priorities that are important for us in terms of fulfilling our why. Generating space to go within, building on negotiating boundaries. This is really about how do we make space to actually do the work. We spend so much time in organizations in meetings, for example. We spend so much time brainstorming, for example, doing the research. But at some point, we actually have to do the outer work, which is whatever's driving the mission forward. And what is driving us forward, right? What do you need to do to nourish yourself so that you can actually show up for work consistently at your best? And then finally, when you're embodying these previous five invitations, you're doing what I'm describing as embodying well-being while well-doing, or you're making mindful change in the world. So for folks that are looking for a deeper dive into those three examples or tips that I shared around really acknowledging, starting with your closest sphere of impact and really assessing where your organization is. This is the framework that I work with organizations on that are interested in doing that deeper dive, longer term work.
That's fantastic. So we'll put a link to your website um, in the text underneath this video. And I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me about this model. I really enjoyed the conversation. And is there anything else, Meico, as we end that you want to share or any other comments you'd like to make today?
I appreciate the opportunity to talk with folks. I'll also just share that I have a book, How to Thrive When Work Doesn't Love You Back, which dives a little bit deeper into the framework that I just shared. And it's really a practical action-based guide for individuals and organizations and also team leaders. The questions that I talked about in terms of assessment, for example, there's a more exhaustive list of questions with actual sample language and practical things that you can do to break out of simply thinking about something, to break out of that research inertia and to actually think about, okay, what are the actionable things that we can do in the next 7 days, in the next 30 days, in the next 90 days, and build on those so that you're snowballing over time and you're beginning to see incremental sustained change in this area around well-being and mental health in the workplace.
That's fantastic. And I think I noticed on your website that the book is featured, right? So if people want to find the book, they can find it through your website also.
Yes, you can find it through the website. And if folks want to stay in contact, the best way to do that is to go to the website and sign up for the newsletter to get updates on all the things that I'm doing.
Wonderful. Thank you, Meico. I so appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today. And I'm grateful you're out in the world with your well-being and well-doing. It's fantastic.
Excellent. Well, I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.